to hello everybody, how's it going? It is Annette the Peacemaker here, and I am doing a live stream today to share the viewing of the Derek Chauvin murder trial. And so they are on lunch break right now, and I've got it up on my second screen up above. So as soon as it comes on, I'll share the screen, and then we'll just kind of watch together quietly. And then we can discuss like when they take breaks or like during sidebars and things like that. But for right now, I'd like to introduce everybody to my friend Vincent. And Vincent lives in what part of Africa? Near Kenya, right?
Yeah, Kenya.
Yes. Okay. So, but you don't live like in the heart of the city. You live in more of a rural community. Is that correct?
Yes.
So before I hit the go live button, we were talking about COVID, but then we were also and how your community is being affected by COVID. So this is unrelated to but it's interesting to me because we're able to hear from somebody living in another country on the other side of the world on how COVID is affecting you. So that's pretty interesting to me. So I just went and got my Johnson & Johnson vaccine just a few minutes ago. I just got home. I feel perfectly fine. My arm is slightly sore, but it's like not even a big deal. And so then I asked Vincent if he had, if they had vaccines available in their community yet. And he said, no, they do not. So then tell us again, how many people just passed from COVID just in your small town?
15.
15 people just passed yesterday. And then in Kenya, in the bigger city, it's much worse, right?
Yeah.
But so are there now in the United States, we've got mask mandates. It's required for people to wear masks. Do you guys have that in Kenya?
Yes.
Very good. And then you're already social distancing, like you would choose to do that whether they mandated it or not, correct?
Yes.
I can tell that I've been watching a court trial for 9 days in a row because I'm speaking like an attorney now. The way that I'm presenting my questions is very similar to what I've been seeing on the trial.
That is
okay, and then yes. So it's definitely a reflection of what I am consuming on the television. So then we talked a little bit about what like police brutality is like in your area, in your community. And you said, so let's repeat that part again. Tell us what just happened in regards to police brutality.
Okay, for example, in Kenya, the law is not allowed police to murder any innocent person. Because human beings have his right. Yes, even
human beings have rights. So they still have human rights there, of course.
Yeah. Even in 2017, during election, some people die, but power come in and those people get their right because the police use a lot of energy to kill some innocent people during election. So
I
it is
see.
not good to police take action on its own or by our hand, because human beings, it is like, have his right to live, to eat, freedom also.
And then, so what was the result of that election? Were you guys able to vote in people that are better for your country? You're allowed to vote,
Uh,
right? Everybody votes.
yeah, people come out to vote for the person he or she like, but there was stealing for voting during election. That is the main was in Kenya, and also corruption. You will get end up that during election, maybe Vincent want to win the vote for and somebody else, even for Otieno, Vincent vice Otieno. Then Otieno come up with some people, even some backup, for example, police and the Mabonsas, even bodyguards, to kill my support or beating my
Oh, okay. So one candidate could
supporters.
have one candidate's supporters will go out and kill the other candidate's supporters so they can't vote for that other candidate.
Yes.
That's insane.
Yeah.
That's insane. So are people, I mean, I know that you follow a lot of us in the United States. You are friends with many people in the Yang gang. And so I know that you follow what's going on in the United States a lot. But is this particular trial on anybody's radar other than yours? Like, do the people in Kenya, do they talk about this trial in the United States? Does this impact you guys in any way?
Okay. I have been watching or following up the living standard of people in America, even some democracy in America. Like in
Okay.
parts, I follow up the Joel Beans for be the president of America. Joel was a good person. Even also me, I was a support wisdom to be a leader. And also, I like that the living standard of America or Democrats of America to come, even our people in Kenya, to follow up that standard of people of America.
I understand. Okay, well, good. So, if I don't know what question I have to follow up with that. What I mean, like, okay, so racism is really bad here in the United States. Is racism very bad in Kenya? Like, it doesn't seem like are there enough white people to cause like a racism crisis at the level that we have it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. When me, I'm also try to do that in Kenya, but I am very poor in finance. I cannot able to do such, but I'm willing and pray so that God to open for me the door. I will change Kenya one day.
I believe you will change Kenya one day because you are very dedicated to human rights, and you're very dedicated to following Andrew Yang and trying to follow in his footsteps. I see that in you all the time. And though I am not a religious person, I know that you are a religious person, and I can see that you are like true and kind and genuine. And I witness that myself every day. So, I mean, even now and again, you send me private messages just to say hello, how are you, and may God bless you, and blah blah blah, you know, things like that. And I think that's very kind. So so I do believe that you will make changes. Oh, okay. So the let's see. I gotta share the screen. Okay, so they are just about to start again. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. So anybody watching, if you would like to, let me make this full screen so you don't have to see all my tabs. Okay, so if you guys would like to join us, I have left the link to come in the comments. And while they are talking, I would like to try to remain as quiet as possible because I hang on every single word. So what we're coming into right now, more than likely, will be because this morning they called a witness who is a pulmonologist, and he is a doctor who is an expert on everything about the lungs and breathing. And he had extremely compelling, knowledge, okay, about he educated us this morning about how the lungs work, how the airway works. And it's significant because he said that fentanyl was not the cause of his death. So that's important. Okay, so here we go. This is Dr. Tobin right here.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tobin.
Hello, Mr. Nelson. Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here with us today. I'll take a sip. Cheers. Like they do in Ireland, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to kind of review a few things with you, sir. I don't think we'll take too long, but so you were ultimately approached by the state of Minnesota to assist them in the review of the medical issues in this case, correct?
Correct.
And you have volunteered to do this work at no cost, correct?
Correct.
And that's, you're not normally involved in criminal cases of this nature, correct?
Correct.
And this is the first time you've ever been involved in a criminal case, correct?
Correct.
And it was that reason that you decided not to charge a fee, correct?
Correct.
Now, when you are in other cases, what type of fee do you normally charge?
I charge per hour. So it's,
what's your hourly rate?
and that my hourly rate is $500 an hour for review material.
Okay. But you agreed to waive your hourly rate for this time, correct? You felt it was an important case, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, in preparation for your testimony today, you met with the state numerous times, correct?
Correct.
You have had the opportunity to review all of the medical information that was obtained in this case, correct?
Yes.
That would include Mr. Floyd's previous medical history, correct?
Correct.
The autopsy and attending toxicology reports that were prepared in this case?
Yes.
As well as some investigative materials, police reports, things of that nature, correct?
Correct.
And just to correct me if I'm wrong, but you are not a pathologist, correct?
Correct. I am not a pathologist.
Your specialty is in pulmonology, critical care, things of that nature.
Correct.
And then you also have an interest and an impressive resume relevant to applied physiology as well.
Correct.
And you've been honored quite extensively for your work in that regard, right?
Correct.
You're not a Minneapolis police officer.
Correct.
It's fair to say that the training that is provided by the Minneapolis Police Department in terms of medical care comes nowhere close to your level of expertise.
Correct.
You understand that Minneapolis police officers are not even EMTs.
Correct.
They have a basic life-saving certificate dealing with gunshots, chest seals, tourniquets, and CPR, right?
Yes.
Right. So you've also had the opportunity to review a lot of the body camera footage, correct?
Yes.
You've done, I think you testified that you've watched these videos hundreds of times.
Correct.
And you've watched them all from all different angles, correct?
Correct.
And you've had the luxury of slowing things down, moving into slow motion, still framing various times, right?
Correct.
And so your analysis of this case comes after hundreds, if not thousands of hours of time spent looking at this information.
I don't know the total amount of time that I've spent, but it's substantial.
Right. So then you ultimately, based on the review of all of that, you prepared a report, correct?
Correct.
And you provided that to the state of Minnesota in late January of this year, right?
January 27th. Yeah.
And after that, you've had numerous meetings with the prosecution team in this case?
And by phone or by Zoom. Yeah.
Right. Including January 30th of this year?
I don't know the dates, but I mean, that sounds correct.
Right. So if I were to tell you the dates were January 30th, March 3rd, March 9th, March 17th, March 21st, April 6th, and April 7th, you would not have any reason to dispute me.
I have no reason to dispute.
And you understand that notes are made of those meetings and provided to the defense in this case, correct?
I understood that.
And then you've also been able to spend a substantial period of time preparing the exhibits that the jury was able to see earlier today, right?
Correct.
And those were all prepared by you or someone within your team, right?
They're prepared by me. Yeah.
And you provided those to the prosecution in advance of today's testimony?
Correct.
And you understand those were provided to me last night?
I have no idea when.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So you've had a lot of time to prepare both yourself as well as the prosecution team in connection with this case. Fair to say?
Correct.
Now, you talked quite a bit about physics in your direct testimony. Agreed?
Yes.
And you would agree that physics or the application of physical forces is a constantly changing set of circumstances.
I didn't catch what you said.
Sure. You would agree with me, would you not, that when you look at the concepts of physics, these things are constantly changing, right?
Yeah, all science is constantly changing.
Constant. I mean,
Yes.
in milliseconds and nanoseconds, right?
Yes.
And so if I put this much weight or this much weight, all of the formulas and variations will change from second to second, millisecond to millisecond, nanosecond to nanosecond. Agreed?
I agree.
Similarly, biology sort of works the same way, right?
Yes.
My heart beats, my lungs breathe, my brain is sending millions of signals to my body at all times.
Correct.
Again, faster than the speed of light, right?
Correct.
Millions of signals every nanosecond, right?
Yes.
And I think in your report, you even kind of discuss that when you're talking about these instances, when you're talking about the physics or the biology, what you're really talking about is a single kind of nanosecond. But all of these processes are working in concert at all times, right?
Right. I mean, the way we calculate it is the mean value, but I mean, it's then into one instant.
You've taken this case and you've literally boiled it down into a nanosecond.
Well, I wouldn't say that, no, because it's obviously in my report, as you see, it's sequentially, there's a whole chronology. I begin from the time the knee is placed on the neck, and then all the time until what's happening in Hennepin County ER.
And so your report talks about the sequential nature of things, but when we talk about the biology and the physics of this case, these things are working simultaneously, contemporaneously, all together, right?
That's correct.
In an incredibly rapid fashion.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that as this incident was occurring, there was nobody measuring the units of force that were placed on any particular position of any particular person at any particular moment, right?
There was nobody there measuring them at the time. I agree that, but they're all calculable.
Understood. And that's when you calculate them, what you have to do is you have to boil it down into what you would call the mean or the average, right?
Correct.
And so whenever we look at the concept of an average, there are things that are happening moments before, moments after, right?
Yes.
And forces will increase or decrease relative to the nanosecond of time. Agreed?
Correct. Yeah.
And ultimately, when we talk about kind of the biology of things, a pathologist tries to look at all the intersection of all of the things that occur to in a particular death investigation, correct?
But I mean, they're not looking at anything to do with physiology.
Understood. But they're also looking at how other factors may contribute to the death of an individual, right?
I mean, they're basically looking.
No, sir.
Sorry?
It's a yes or no, sir, so I'm objecting.
Well, yes, partly.
They're looking at things beyond a nanosecond. Agreed?
No, I mean, I think in terms of a pathologist, they're looking at a nanosecond. They're looking at the nanosecond of death.
Right. But they're taking into consideration things simply that extend beyond physiology, right?
I mean, they're looking primarily at pathology.
Right. So what causes the heart to stop? What causes the lungs to cease to function, etc. Right?
I mean, they're making an inference based on a pathological time point.
Considering a multitude of biological factors that are involved in the death of a person, right?
I mean, it's the same as any physician is looking at a multitude of factors.
So in terms, again, of your review, you would agree that the amount of time that you've spent looking at videos, analyzing these videos from different perspectives and angles is far greater than the length of this incident.
Yes.
Probably to the times 1,000.
I can't, I really don't know. But I mean, but it's substantially longer than the incident.
And ultimately, you conclude that Mr. Floyd died as what we would call a hypoxic death.
He died of a low level of oxygen.
Right. That there was a low level of oxygen that caused damage to the brain, which resulted in a pulseless electrical activity, correct?
Not quite.
How did you phrase it?
He had a low level of oxygen that caused damage to the brain. The brain didn't cause the pulses, electrical alternates. The low level of oxygen caused both. The low level of oxygen caused the damage to the brain. The low level of oxygen separately caused the pulses, electrical alternates.
So it's an example of how multiple processes are occurring simultaneously.
Well, not really. It's just one process. It's a low level of oxygen that's doing both.
That's having an effect on multiple, the heart and the brain and the lungs, right?
Not really. It's just two, the brain and the heart.
Brain and the heart. All right. Now you talked about, I think you called it is it the nuchal ligament?
Yes.
Am I saying that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
That's that space at the back of the neck. That's very, very hard, right?
It's not so much a space. I mean, it's a long bit, but it's roughly the palm of your hand. You stick the palm of your hand at the back of your neck,
right,
and you're right over the nuchal ligament.
Right. And that's you said a very, very hard surface, right?
Yeah.
Can withstand a great amount of pressure, right?
Correct.
And and so when we talk about the placement of the knee, there would be periods of time where Mr. Chauvin's knee was placed at that nuchal ligament, based on your observation of the videos.
I'm sorry. Tell me that goes both ways.
Opportunity to review the autopsy, correct?
I did, yeah.
You understand that there was no bruising either atop the skin or under the skin surfaces that were noted by Dr. Baker.
Yes, I'm aware.
And you also are aware that you talked quite a bit about the hypopharynx, right?
Yes.
You're aware that the hypopharynx was photographed at autopsy and no injury was noted.
I'm aware.
Now, I found it very interesting in your testimony, in your report, when you're kind of talking about this notion of speak, or if you can speak, it doesn't mean you can, or, sorry, I have to say, if you can speak, you can breathe,
Yes.
right? And you described this as a very dangerous proposition, right?
Yes. Yes.
You described this as causing a false sense of security to people, right? That's how you.
Correct. Yeah.
And in fact, in your report, you actually write a paragraph about how physicians oftentimes have trouble with this, right?
Yes.
And so people who've, similar to yourself, attended medical school,
Mhm.
right? Sorry, you have to say yes.
I'm sorry, terribly sorry.
No problem.
Yes.
So, intelligent men and women who've graduated from college, gone on to medical school, and are engaged in the practice of medicine sometimes have problems with this notion, right?
Yes.
A patient comes in and says that they're having trouble breathing, and oftentimes a physician will not believe them, essentially.
It's important, Mr. Nelson, to make sure we're talking about speech or difficulty in breathing, because they're different.
Right. Well, you write in your report that some doctors incorrectly consider patients to be hysterical.
Your Honor, may we approach? Let's see the journals. Your Honor, the reference to the report is hearsay. It's not an evidence. It's not proper. Overruled. Overruled.
You wrote in your report that some doctors incorrectly consider patients hysterical and the symptoms imaginary in nature, which further aggregates patient distress, right?
Yes. Yes, I recall.
And you wrote that this view represents a physician's failure to understand the fundamental cause of a clinical disorder.
Right, but I'm talking about a different thing there. That's hyperventilation syndrome,
So somebody
which
comes
is
in,
very different than the difficulty with speech. They're really apples and oranges.
okay? But if physicians, right, someone comes in and they're
Yeah.
hyperventilating and they articulate to their physician,
Yes.
I can't breathe,
Yes.
right? And it's hyperventilation syndrome, right?
Yes.
And physicians oftentimes, as you indicate,
Yes.
confuse this issue.
Correct.
They blame the patient, right? Or
I don't have to blame the patient, but I mean, they certainly missed the diagnosis.
Haha. I like this doctor.
and it's a kind of when we're talking about speaking and breathing simultaneously, which is a different consideration. If a Minneapolis police lieutenant who trains police officers happened to have testified that that's a common statement in the course of treatment or in the course of training of Minneapolis police officers, you might take exception with that statement.
I didn't follow your question. It's very hard to hear through that plexiglass.
And I'm losing my voice, I think. Excuse me.
Eat a cough drop, douchebag.
If a Minneapolis police officer,
Yeah.
I'll try to talk closer to the mic,
Mhm.
the Minneapolis police lieutenant who trains Minneapolis police officers testified that it is frequently said and trained to police officers that a person can talk, it means they can breathe. You would have a problem with that.
Yes, I mean, they're able to breathe at that moment in time, but 10 seconds later, they may be dead.
Right. And because dealing with any person is a rapidly evolving situation that can change from second to second.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the calculations that you've made, you would agree that your calculations are generally theoretical, correct?
No, they're not theoretical. I mean, they're based on direct measurements. They're based on extensive research.
But you're making certain assumptions in the application of that science, are you not?
Very few assumptions.
You're assuming the weight of Mr. Chauvin.
Right, I'm aware. So, I mean, obviously, I'm aware that there's two different weights that are given.
And you're assuming the weight of the equipment that the officer wears.
Yes,
And you've not actually ever physically measured the weight of the equipment a police officer
Oh my
carries,
God,
correct?
this guy.
no, I mean, I took the measurements that are reported.
And you're not actually weighing what Mr. Chauvin weighed on May 25th of 2020.
No,
And in your measurements, you appear to be, at least from my understanding, which is going to be limited, from my understanding, is that your measurements assumed an equal weight distribution between the right and the left legs.
yes, that's correct.
All right. And so again, as we know, as things change and evolve and flow, that's weight is pretty frequently redistributed, right?
That is correct.
And again, in terms of the EELV, am I saying
Yes.
that right? The EELV, that's the, can you?
And expiratory lung volume.
All right. You're also basing that, those calculations on the presumption that a person is a healthy individual, right?
For the ELV, it's not going to change, really.
But in terms of the normal respiratory rate, some of the other factors that you put into your analysis, it's all premised upon a healthy individual, right?
Right, it's based on a 46-year-old person of a particular height and sex, yes.
Who's healthy.
Correct.
And so you would agree if biology can change rapidly, that the specific biological conditions of Mr. Chauvin and or Mr. Floyd come into play, right?
Correct.
And those volumes or those figures that you've assessed in connection with this case, they are conditioned upon him being a healthy individual.
Right. I mean, it varies in terms of the lungs. I mean, say, for example, compliance will vary, but end expiratory lung volume is pretty robust. It just isn't going to vary.
Okay, so but other factors, like you said, what was the first sentence?
Lung compliance will vary from one person to the next person, but it varies different segments within the lung. They're not all monolithic.
Okay. Now, and you talked about one thing in terms of, and this is a little bit of an aside, in terms of the prone position and the pushing of the stomach into the lungs, right?
Yes.
The size of a person's stomach has some bearing on that, right?
It does.
A person like myself who has a few extra inches, if I'm prone, it's going to perhaps push further or harder up into my lungs, right?
Yes.
A person who is healthy, physical, muscular, it's going to have less of an impact. This is a little bit of an aside. But again, in terms of what we have learned about Mr. Floyd from his autopsy and his medical records, is that we understand that Mr. Floyd had some heart disease, right?
That is correct.
In fact, I believe that he had in some of his arteries somewhere between a 75 and 90% occlusion of his ventricular arteries, right?
Correct.
And that's going to affect blood flow in a person, right? It's going to make the body work a little harder to get the blood through the body.
No, not really. It's not going to do that.
Okay. How does that affect a person's respiratory?
The coronary artery,
Mhm.
if the coronary artery is affecting it, and if the coronary artery was contributing to shortness of breath, you would expect that he would be complaining of chest pain, and you would expect that he would be demonstrating a very rapid respiratory rate. We don't see either.
Okay. We'll come back to the respiration. I can't say it. I'm taken by your accent. The respiratory
I
rate.
can't compensate for it.
Appreciate it. I'll say it like you, his respiratory rate.
There you go.
All right. We also understand that Mr. Floyd, based on his medical records, has a history of hypertension or high blood pressure.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in terms of, we also understand that Mr. Floyd had previously been diagnosed with COVID-19, right?
Correct.
And he may not be have been symptomatic on March 25th, but it's fair to say that a lot is unknown about the effects of COVID-19 on a person's lungs long term.
I mean, not as much as it would appear to be the case. I mean, because obviously it's a viral illness. We have a huge amount of information about the long-term effects of viral illnesses.
And those can affect the elasticity of the lungs, right?
Not the elasticity. It would be, if it's having any effect, it would be within the sensory receptors within the tracheobronchial tree. So that really wouldn't have anything to do with the elasticity.
Okay. Now, but we also learned quite a bit about the toxicology as well. Excuse me. On the COVID-19, you testified that treatment of people with COVID-19 includes leaving them in the prone position, right?
Correct.
And so those people who would be treated for COVID-19 in the prone position, based on your calculations, you would have a 24% decrease in the EELV.
Right. I mean, this is people with COVID where they're during the time that they have COVID.
But that's what you'd expect, that same decrease in the EELV.
No, it's going to be very different in somebody who has, say, pneumonia. What's going to happen in the prone position will be very variable from one person to another as a result of the pneumonia. It's different than normal lungs.
Okay. So in essence, every person is different.
Oh, for certain.
And now you calculated his respiratory rate to be 22, right? And you said that was within the normal respiratory rate?
Yeah.
And you would not describe him as hyperventilating?
And the word hyperventilation is open to an awful lot of misinterpretation. That is most certainly not hyperventilation. No.
And hyperventilation assists in the removal of carbon dioxide from the body, right?
It's confusing. It's not that simple.
In its simplest terms.
In the simplest terms, yes, it does assist. It gets rid of carbon dioxide. But it can be frequently misleading.
Now, in terms of the toxicology of Mr. Floyd, we did learn that there were some controlled substances in his system, right?
Yes.
We know that there was, for example, nicotine, right?
Yes.
Mr. Floyd was a smoker.
Correct.
And smoking changes the lung function, agreed?
Oh my God.
Now, we also learned more, and I'm not suggesting that all people who smoke have lung problems, right?
Less than 10% do. 90% don't have any.
From microphone.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
So you focused in your direct examination quite a bit in terms of fentanyl and the fentanyl's effect on the respiration rate.
Yes.
And you would agree generally that fentanyl is a respiratory depressant.
It can be.
It's used in operating rooms, right?
Yes.
And it's also used in the management of chronic pain, right?
That is correct.
And medically speaking, those are really the only two reasons that fentanyl would be prescribed.
Yes, probably.
But you understand that fentanyl has become far more prolific in street drugs, right?
Yes, I'm aware.
And you would agree generally that there is a significant difference between fentanyl that's manufactured according to the United States, whatever
Guidelines.
rules apply, right?
Mhm.
The pharmaceutical companies make it much differently than the street dealers do, right?
I imagine so.
And so when a person is ingesting illicit street purchased fentanyl, it's every time they take a fentanyl dose, it's a different experience for that person.
Right, but if it's affecting the respiratory center, it's going to act through the mu receptors in the medulla oblongata. There's no way around that.
Right.
It's not, if fentanyl isn't going to have an effect on respiration by some other mechanism.
Understood. But the end result of fentanyl can include respiratory depression.
Right, through the mu receptors.
Right. And we also learned that there was methamphetamine in a low dose in Mr. Floyd's system, right?
Correct.
And the fentanyl and the methamphetamine, they can kind of counteract each other, right?
Well, I mean, they're up and downers, but in terms of the respiratory centers, there's not going to be.
So the methamphetamine would not, the methamphetamine is going to increase the heart rate, right?
That's a different thing than the respiratory centers.
Understood, but methamphetamine will increase a person's heart rate, right?
Yes.
That's one of the side effects.
Yes.
And there are a few there are a few conditions where a physician can lawfully prescribe methamphetamine, right?
Yes.
But it's exceedingly rare that it's actually done.
I can't say, but it's definitely a prescribable agent. It used to be used commonly for appetite suppressant.
And I think ADHD, is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So we also know that adrenaline will increase the heart rate, right?
Yes.
And adrenaline can be put into the body in multiple ways, right? Well, let me. There are many things that can cause a surge in adrenaline.
Yes.
One of those things would be in getting into a fight with someone.
Yes.
Or being afraid.
Difficult to know in terms of being afraid, but getting into a fight.
And the paraganglionoma that was found, I understand you call it the 10% tumor, but in 10% of the tumor cases that can cause an adrenaline surge.
Yes, and in the 90% of total.
Now,
I have to grab a
in
blanket. I'll
terms
be
of
right
the
back.
use of fentanyl in the hospital setting, surgical setting, have you become familiar with what's called wooden chest syndrome?
Yes, I have.
And can you explain for the jury what wooden chest syndrome
In
is?
some patients with fentanyl, you get an increase in chest wall thickness.
So the lungs become less elastic?
Not
I get
quite the
really
lungs,
cold.
but chest
Really
wall.
easy.
Okay, so that would prevent a chest wall tight or chest wall rigidity will also decrease the performance of the lungs.
It will impede the ability of the lungs to expand.
Now, in your report, you wrote that you would expect the peak respiratory depression to occur from fentanyl within 5 minutes of ingestion.
Right.
And have you come to learn that tablets were found or controlled substances were found in the backseat of Squad 320?
I've heard reports to that effect. I don't know what the status of it is.
So you've not been provided with any additional information since the time you've prepared your report?
I'm sure that's wrong, but I've been provided with a lot of information. I don't necessarily recall, keep it all
Sure.
at the front of my brain.
Okay. Well, yesterday we heard testimony from the State Crime Lab that there were in the backseat of the squad car 2 partially consumed pills found in the back of Squad 320.
Objection, Your Honor, to the characterization of testimony.
To the characterization of.
Or if it's foundational to your.
It is.
How do we know the pills weren't
You
planted?
understand that?
No,
And how do we know that the
I'm
pills
hiding.
weren't there from a
Not funny.
previous occupant in the back seat of the car?
Yesterday, a chemist from the state crime lab
Okay.
testified in this case.
Rulings, it's sustained, you can state in the form of a hypothetical, however.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I can't hear you.
The sidebar.
Okay. So I knew that they were going to try to spin the drug angle. This is basically their only defense is that it could have been his health, his drug use. And I'm really looking forward to the medical examiner that did the autopsy, because I'm hoping to find that it wasn't enough drugs, whatever. Like maybe he took the pills like the day before or something like that. Like, I don't know how long meth and fentanyl last in a person's system. You know, I don't know.
Let me
So,
ask.
I knew they were going to use the drug angle, though.
Hypothetical question. Okay. If partially ingested pills that were determined to contain both fentanyl and methamphetamine were found partially ingested in the back seat of the squad car, and that those pills had the DNA of the deceased individual on them, meaning that they took them, and those pills would have been in his mouth at about 2018, right? Is it fair to say that you would expect the peak fentanyl respiratory depression within about 5 minutes?
Right. I mean, obviously, it would depend on how much of it was ingested. I mean, just finding the pills won't tell you anything about whether any of it was ingested or some of it or anything. But if there was any amount of it ingested, yes, the peak would be 5 minutes.
Right. And so if it happened at 2018 or thereabouts, when the individual was in the back of the car, you would expect that peak respiratory depression to be around 2013, right? 2023, I'm sorry. 2018 to 2023 is.
You're trying to really confuse me, Mr. Nelson.
I'm sorry. I think I can actually say it's been a long week now. So 2018 is the ingestion point. You would expect peak respiratory depression by 2023.
Correct.
Right? That's the peak, meaning that it could continue afterwards, right?
Right.
All right. You also described in your direct testimony what you have interpreted to be an anoxic seizure, right?
Yes.
At 2024.
Correct. 24, 21.
2024.
21.
21. And that was in what you saw and what the jury was played was reflected in from Officer Lane's body camera, right?
Correct.
And it was the kick of the legs, right?
Yes.
And after that point, you can see Officer Lane hold the leg down, right?
Yes.
And you can see it kick up again,
Yes.
right?
Trying to talk over each other.
Sorry. A tendency to go fast.
So they've been trying to say
That's
that
what
he
you
was kicking at
recognize
them.
based on your 46 years of being a pulmonologist and an intensivist and your experience, right?
Right. I mean, obviously there was additional information from the hand, but the leg was the key.
So he was probably
And
having this seizure and
Would be
not like
reasonable for a
intentionally
police officer
kicking.
to interpret that same behavior as resistance.
Objection, Your Honor. Foundation witness to talk about this.
Yes. So
The same.
Now, you testified that the last breath of Mr. Floyd was at 20:25:16, right?
Correct.
Prior to that point, to all people who were there and monitoring him, he would have appeared to have been breathing, right?
It's just hard for me to hear.
Sorry. Prior to that point,
Yeah.
would be reasonable that he would appear to be breathing, right?
Yes.
And in fact, you showed us a segment where you were able to count his respiratory rates.
Yes.
Right? And then you said that at 20:35 and 06 seconds is when the first air was pumped back into him.
Correct.
All right. And you understand that paramedics arrived at 20:27 and 45 seconds.
Yes.
And so the time between when the paramedics arrived and Mr. Floyd got his first air was roughly 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes.
Yes. Yeah.
And according to timelines, the drive to the hospital is about 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Were you aware that the drive to the hospital is about 5 minutes?
I wasn't aware, but I have no reason to dispute it.
And so between 20:27 and 45 seconds when the EMTs first arrived and the time they got him to have an air in his lungs, that was a crucial 9 minutes.
Yes.
Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Mr. Blackwell.
There's no defense against what this physician is saying, you guys. He tries to discredit the experts.
Dr. Chauvin,
it's
just a
totally
few questions, just for clarification's sake.
I love this.
You would just ask a lot of questions about science and medicine, changing, constantly changing, evolving by the nanosecond, by the millisecond. You heard all of that.
Yes, I did.
I want to go to the period of time when Mr. Chauvin was on the back and neck of Mr. Floyd.
Yes.
Did you see him get off of the back of Mr. Floyd by the nanosecond, by the millisecond, by any seconds in the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that you saw him on?
No, I did not.
If you look at the 5 minutes and 3 seconds that you focused on, where, if you consider all the nanoseconds and milliseconds in the 5 minutes and 3 seconds,
Beautiful.
where was Mr. Chauvin the vast majority of that time?
He was on Mr. Floyd's neck and on his back and arm.
Right, not constantly changing.
No.
Now, you asked questions about what injuries were noted on autopsy.
Yes.
And I think reference was made, there was no injury noted to the hypopharynx on autopsy.
Correct.
Does that make any difference to you whatsoever?
None whatsoever. I wouldn't expect there to be anything found there.
And why
at
not?
Autopsy.
Why not, Dr. Tolman?
Because the effects on the hypopharynx are not something that is going to remain at the time of an autopsy. I mean, the type of changes that we see, say, in somebody with sleep apnea, that's not something you're going to see the following morning when you look at somebody. It's just not there.
Well, there was also a reference made to the absence of bruising on the neck during autopsy.
Yes.
Does that make any difference to you whatsoever?
No, because obviously whenever I go to church, I sit on a hard bench. I don't get bruising of my buttocks when I leave. So I wouldn't expect anything in terms of that. So if you have somebody, this was a static force. It's not as if somebody is jamming against it. So you wouldn't expect anything in the way of bruising.
And scientifically, do you know of any correlation between the presence or absence of bruising on autopsy and the forces necessary to restrict breathing?
No, they're totally different because it's in terms of static forces and dynamic.
What about low oxygen? If somebody suffers or dies from low oxygen,
Yes.
does that show up on autopsy?
No, it does not.
And the fact that it doesn't, does that mean anything to you whatsoever?
It has no meaning.
And why not?
Because low oxygen is a functional thing, just like an arrhythmia is a functional thing. It doesn't leave a fingerprint on the autopsy. It's just there. It's something that happened. But it won't leave any fingerprint afterwards. You don't see it.
But doesn't mean that the person didn't die from low oxygen.
No, absolutely not. So if you take somebody and you suffocate him with a pillow, and it's very clear to you after you suffocated the person and he's dead from the pillow, you're not going to see the effects of the low oxygen.
Now, you were asked quite a few questions about Mr. Floyd's pre-existing health conditions.
Correct.
And remember, he cited a number of those.
Yes.
Do any of those conditions have anything to do with the cause of Mr. Floyd's death, in your professional opinion, whatsoever?
None whatsoever.
And again, what was the cause such that those conditions don't matter?
The cause of death is a low level of oxygen that caused the brain damage and caused the heart to stop.
You were also asked questions about substances in Mr. Floyd's system. I think you were asked questions about nicotine. Remember that?
Yes.
He didn't die from nicotine, did he?
Oh,
You were asked questions about fentanyl and meth.
yes.
Any evidence that he died from meth?
No. None.
You were asked questions about whether he had ingested any fentanyl within 5 minutes of his time of death.
Yes.
Now, I think you explained to us that if somebody is suffering from a fentanyl overdose, you would see a depression in the respiratory system.
Yes.
And depression means some reduction in the rate or ability to breathe.
My
Correct.
husband brought me lunch.
Did you see any depression in Mr. Floyd's ability to breathe whatsoever before he went unconscious?
No, absolutely not. He was normal respiratory rate.
Any evidence then that any fentanyl in his system depressed his breathing in any way whatsoever?
No, and that's further borne out in the carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. No further
Okay.
questions.
Anything further?
Yes.
Two very quick questions. In terms of the carbon dioxide level, you testified that it was at a 96.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't catch.
You testified that the carbon dioxide was at a 96,
I think it was 89.
89. It was also measured at 102. Did you?
Well, that's the venous one, but not the arterial is the one you need to look at.
And in terms of the ingestion of, or just generally speaking, fentanyl can also cause death as a result of low oxygen to the brain, right?
But it would have to be low through respiratory depression.
Question is, fentanyl can also cause a death as a result of low oxygen.
Well, your answer is yes, but only in bar.
Fair enough. Thanks.
Briefly.
Mr. Nelson brought up again fentanyl as a cause of death.
Yes.
Doctor, you're familiar with the way people die from fentanyl.
Yes, very.
Do they or do they not go into a coma before they die from a fentanyl overdose?
Yes, they will.
Was Mr. Floyd ever in a coma?
No.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin.
Okay.
Anything else? Thank you. Doctor, thank you so much.
That was beautiful
Thank you.
testimony.
Let's take a 5-minute break so we can all get our voices back.
Okay. So the fentanyl argument was just debunked in that testimony. The methamphetamine argument was just debunked in that testimony. Earlier this morning, he showed in video, he broke down the video like second by second, basically. And he was able to show when Mr. Floyd stopped breathing. Like here he's breathing and he counted like his last 8 breaths. And right there he stops. He stops breathing. And then Chauvin continued to keep his knee on his neck and his other knee on his back and shoulder. So he was able to pinpoint that because I wasn't able to see that his that his right knee was pinning down George's left shoulder. So his right shoulder was over by the tire, and that was the side that was facing like the sidewalk and the bystanders and stuff like that. And then on his left shoulder, though, was Chauvin's other knee. And so he had basically his full entire body weight spread out across from his neck down to his left shoulder blade and pinning that down. And then the officer in the middle, which I believe is Officer Kang or King, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Okay, but that officer in the middle, he and Chauvin both were like Chauvin, you can see, because he's the only one with black gloves on. Everybody else has their bare hands. So behind his back, he's handcuffed behind his back, and Chauvin has a hold of these 3 fingers right here with his black gloved hand, and he is squeezing it so tight. You can just see how George's 3 fingers are being like smashed in his death grip right there. And at the same time, he and Officer Kang are both shoving his arm like up further like this, right? And so George is trying to breathe by lifting up his right shoulder like this. So his face is out like this. Okay, so at one point his face is down. He's face planted in the asphalt, and his shoulder was up. So he was trying to lift himself up enough that he could get air into his lungs. And then he was able to turn his head to the side, but then his shoulder went down. And that's how he showed that he was trying to breathe, was by the movement, that tiny little movement of his shoulder. And so the doctor was able to prove that, like you can see, his muscle right here is protruded when it was up, and then you can see that the muscle is relaxed when the shoulder is down. And so he was able to prove that. And then so he showed, again, like I said before, that he showed that when he stopped breathing, and then Chauvin still kept his knees on his neck and back for, I want to say at least 3 more minutes, because the EMTs came shortly after that. So 3 to 5 more minutes, something like that. So, and then the stretching of the arm behind his back also ends up putting more weight on his left side, because that's where they were pulling it up, right? Everything was happening on the left side of George's body. And then the other thing that stood out to me towards the end there, when they were talking about him kicking. So the defense has been saying that, he was still resisting because he was kicking. And then they've talked about this tool called the hobbling tool. And what that is, like, they put something around your ankles, I don't know, some sort of cuffs or something around your ankles. And then there's like a cord or rope or whatever, and that connects up to at like the waistband, or to, basically it's a hog tying tool, except that I think they let the legs remain straight. They don't pull the legs up at the knees in like a full-fledged hog tie. Okay. So Officer Tao, who was the one, if you haven't been following, Officer Tao was the one in the front doing crowd control. So he was the bald Asian man up in the front. And so earlier in testimony, like at the beginning, we saw Officer Tao go into the trunk of the squad car and pull out the hobbling tool. But then apparently they never used the hobbling tool on him. Okay. So they said that he was still kicking, but then Dr. Tobin just said that it was the kicking that alerted him that like some little part of his brain had expired, because that, you know, like you see like people, I don't know, people jerk a little bit, right, when they're dying. So he was having some kind of seizure, and that was making him kick. But they're trying to say that he was still resisting because he was kicking, and that those kicks would be considered like hostile, aggressive. He was aggressively resisting. No, he was not. He was aggressively dying. He was aggressively fighting for his life, man. That's what was happening. So those kicks that they are trying to say was like a threat to the officers, even though he was handcuffed behind his back, in the prone position, face down in the asphalt, with 3 grown men well over 100 pounds. So he had at the very least, he had 300 pounds of weight sitting on him, because every one of those officers certainly weighs more than 100 pounds. And then every one of those officers has on a tool belt. And in previous testimony, a tool belt weighs somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. So let's assume that each one of the officers weighs, like 150, give or take. So 1, 3, 4, that's 450 pounds, right? I'm really bad at math in my head. And then add, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say it's 20 pounds. So 20, 40, 60. So 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 510 pounds approximately was the weight on top of his body while he was handcuffed and in a prone position. So yeah, that's insane.
Next witness, please.
Okay, next witness.
The state calls Daniel Eisenschmidt.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, that nothing but the truth?
I do.
And if you wouldn't mind removing your mask for testimony.
I like how they don't make them swear on a Bible, and you don't have to swear to
Begin by
God.
having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is Daniel, Daniel, Eisenschmidt, Isenschmid.
Ms. Aldridge.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Where do you work?
I work at NMS Labs, Horsham, Pennsylvania.
You say in Horsham, Pennsylvania? How long have you been with NMS Labs?
Since 2011.
What do you do at NMS Labs?
I'm a forensic toxicologist at NMS.
And did you have any other lab experience before joining NMS?
Yes, I did. Prior to joining NMS from 1994 to 2011, I was the chief toxicologist for the Wayne County, Michigan Medical Examiner's Office. And before that, I was at Southgate Medical Lab, so I was the director of the toxicology. And prior to that, from 1982 to 1991, I was at Maryland Medical Labs in Baltimore, Maryland. Also during that period, working at some time during the, I think it was from 84 to 86 at the medical examiner's office in Baltimore as well.
So rewinding a bit as well to your educational background, could you just describe for the jury what your educational background is?
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from Adelphi University in Garden City, New York, and that was attained in 1982. Then I have a master's degree in forensic pathology with pathology with a concentration in forensic toxicology, and that's from University of Maryland at Baltimore. That was in 1986. And then my PhD was from University of Maryland at Baltimore in forensic toxicology in 1991.
Do you have any specialized certifications related to your work?
I'm board certified as a fellow from the American Board of Forensic Toxicology.
And what are the requirements for that?
So the requirements for that, they've changed over the years, but for the fellow requirement, you can apply to the board after 3 years after you have your PhD. They examine your credentials to see that you're active in the field of forensic toxicology. If you have the right references and you're active in the field, they'll allow you to sit for an examination. And then if you pass the examination, the board votes on your final certification. After that, you have to do continuing education each year and attain a minimum number of continuing education credits. And then every 5 years, you have to apply to the board for reaccreditation.
And have you gone through all those requirements and satisfied them successfully?
Yes, I have.
And are you up to date with all of those continuing education requirements as well?
I am.
I'm going to get back to sort of your role as a forensic toxicologist. Could you describe sort of your day-to-day job duties as a forensic toxicologist at NMS Labs?
So my primary responsibility at NMS Labs is to do case review. And what that means is when toxicology tests are performed at NMS Labs, particularly ones that require many different kinds of tests to be done, they wind up being reviewed by a toxicologist or certifying scientist to look at them in the context of all the testing that was done. So individual tests are reviewed by analysts in the laboratory, and they're secondary reviewed as well. But the final review comes to either a toxicologist or certifying scientist that looks at everything in the context of the entire case.
And then in that capacity, is it part of your job duties to author reports and sign off on all of that testing?
Yes, it is.
Approximately how many cases have you reviewed in that capacity as a forensic toxicologist?
I review about 7,000 to 8,000 cases per year.
And in terms of the work that comes into NMS, a variety of agencies that submit samples to NMS Labs for testing?
Yes, we get samples from medical examiners and coroners. We get samples from police agencies for DUI cases. And we also get a lot of clinical samples from hospitals and referral laboratories.
So in that capacity, does NMS receive both postmortem or death-related samples as well as samples from living patients?
Yes, we do.
And NMS as a lab, approximately how many tests or samples does NMS receive for testing each day?
We receive about 12 to 1,300 requisitions each day.
And when you say requisitions, what is that?
It would mean requests for testing. It could be multiple samples on a requisition.
So thousands of tests a year.
Thousands of tests a day.
Tens of thousands of tests a year. My math is bad. All right. Is NMS a licensed and accredited lab?
It is.
And does that include national accreditations as well?
National and state accreditations.
I'm going to turn to your work in this particular case. Did NMS Labs receive some samples for testing from the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office related to George Floyd?
We did.
And were there a number of different samples that were received?
Correct.
What were the samples that were ultimately tested by NMS Labs?
So we tested the samples that were requested by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner to be tested. So we tested samples that were labeled as hospital blood, and we also tested urine that was collected at the autopsy.
And in terms of the testing that was performed at NMS Labs, were those tests pursuant to standard operating procedures at the lab?
Yes, they were.
And that process was followed for all of those tests?
Yes.
Getting to the results from that testing, what were the notable findings from that testing?
So the most notable findings in the hospital blood was the presence of fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter. And then the metabolite of fentanyl, the breakdown product of fentanyl, norfentanyl, at a concentration of 5.6 nanograms per milliliter. In addition, we found methamphetamine at 19 nanograms per milliliter.
So I'm going to talk about each of those substances one by one, and you indicated these were the results from the hospital blood in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
So let's start with methamphetamine. What is methamphetamine?
So methamphetamine is a central nervous system stimulant. It can actually be prescribed. It rarely is, but it can be prescribed under the brand name Digoxin, and it is used for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and also obesity. It was also experimentally used for treatment of narcolepsy. And between 2016, 2018, there were about 10,000 prescriptions in the US written for Digoxin that year, each year.
So can methamphetamine be both a street level recreational drug and also a prescription drug?
It can.
With respect to the results, the 19 nanograms per milliliter that you found of methamphetamine, what significance, if any, is there to that amount?
Well, that is actually approximately the amount that you would find in the blood in somebody that was given a single dose of methamphetamine as a prescribed drug.
So when you say you described the prescription drug form in which methamphetamine can be available, the results would be consistent with the prescription dose of that. Is that right?
Yes, it could be.
Would that be considered a low level of methamphetamine?
Yes, very low.
And you also talked about the fentanyl results of 11 nanograms per milliliter. First, what is fentanyl?
So fentanyl is a opioid and analgesic. It's used similar to morphine. It's much more potent than morphine. It can be used to treat pain and also be an adjunct use in surgery and for anesthesia.
And you talked about opioids. Maybe you could just describe what an opioid is.
So opioids are actually include both natural, semi-synthetic, and synthetic drugs that act on the mu receptor, which are where opioids act. Opiates are natural products that are found in the poppy plants, such as morphine and codeine. So opiates are opioids, but not all opioids are opiates.
So what are some examples of opioids?
So fentanyl would be an example of an opioid.
Would oxycodone also be an opioid?
Yes, it would.
And then you talked about similarities between opioids and opiates. Is that right?
Yes.
And you mentioned morphine as an opiate.
Yes.
Is that heroin?
So heroin is actually made from morphine, but when heroin breaks down, it breaks down into a metabolite called 6-acetylmorphine, and then eventually to morphine.
So heroin would break down into 6-acetylmorphine and morphine. Is that right?
Yes.
Do opioids and opiates have similar effects?
Yes.
Getting back to the fentanyl level in this case, you mentioned it was 11 nanograms per milliliter. Can fentanyl levels vary widely depending on an individual?
Yes, they can.
And why would that be?
Because of tolerance.
And could you just explain how an individual's drug tolerance might affect the impact a particular drug like an opioid or fentanyl might have on them?
So, I mean, if a person becomes tolerant to a drug, you need to have more and more of the drug to get the desired effect. So with chronic use, to get the same feeling that you would at a given concentration of fentanyl, you need to take more to get that effect.
And so if someone is regularly using opiates or opioids, would that individual then develop a tolerance to an opioid like fentanyl?
Yes.
All right. Now you also talked about norfentanyl. Could you just describe what norfentanyl is?
So when the body gradually eliminates fentanyl, it breaks it down from fentanyl to norfentanyl. That's a gradual process that occurs over time. And it's one of the ways the body eliminates fentanyl.
And you indicated that the amount of norfentanyl found in the hospital blood in this case was 5.6 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Yes.
And what is significant about that amount of norfentanyl?
Well, it shows that some of the fentanyl was metabolized to norfentanyl. It also could mean there was pre-existing norfentanyl with additional fentanyl given on top of that. But it basically shows that when we see very recent deaths with fentanyl, We frequently see fentanyl with no norfentanyl whatsoever because after a very acute fentanyl intoxication, the body doesn't have time to break it down.
Yes.
And you described when you see a fentanyl overdose, typically you may not see any norfentanyl or low levels of norfentanyl.
Correct.
I was
In
hoping for
addition to
that.
those findings from the hospital blood, were there some other findings as well that were included in your report?
There were some incidental findings. I believe there was cocaine, which was from smoking. There was caffeine. There was evidence of prior marijuana use, but the presence of cannabinoids. I would have to look at the report to know.
And would that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
If we could put on the screen, just for the witness's recollection, Exhibit 624, please. And then if we could zoom in on the positive findings portion. All right. Referring to your report now, could you describe the other findings with respect to this case?
Yeah, so the additional finding was a compound called 4-ANPP. That is actually a precursor to fentanyl manufacturing, but it is also a metabolite of fentanyl. It's not pharmacologically significant. That's probably mostly inactive, but it was measured as part of some additional testing that was requested by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner. And then in the urine findings, we had presumptive positive findings, not confirmed for cannabinoids, amphetamines, and fentanyl. Those were not confirmed because they were present in the blood, so that follows that. And then we also had findings for opiates in the urine, and we were asked to confirm those, and we found a concentration of morphine in the urine of 86 nanograms per milliliter.
Apologies. Sorry, you were saying that you found morphine in the urine of 86 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
And was that morphine found in the blood?
No, it was not.
And can a finding of morphine in the urine be indicative of a prior use in advance of the time of death?
Yes, it can. You can see morphine in urine for several days, depending on the dose and prior use pattern.
And again, is that because it shows up in urine longer than blood?
Yes.
So you
Very
tested
good.
both hospital blood as well as the urine. You described the findings in the urine with respect to morphine. You were also discussing the 4-ANPP finding in the hospital blood. With respect to the other findings in your report, can you just sort of summarize what they were and whether they were significant at all?
So I think I mentioned, so there was caffeine, which is present in many of us, and cotinine, which is present as a metabolite of nicotine from smoking. And then cannabinoids, there was delta-9 THC at 2.9 nanograms per milliliter, and its breakdown product 11-hydroxy delta-9 THC at 1.2 nanograms per milliliter, and then the inactive delta-9 carboxy THC at 42 nanograms per milliliter.
And when it comes to these THC findings or THC findings relating to cannabinoids, what, if any, impact does that have?
It's very hard to interpret those, given the nature of the samples, and also what happens with cannabinoids, because they go into the fat, so they can be released slowly with time. And certainly, anything like CPR or something like that's potentially going to release THC from the fat. So it doesn't really mean a whole lot other than cannabinoids were used at some point in time.
So they can remain in the system and be detected for an extended period of time. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. We can take that down. Thank you. Now, as part of your testing process at NMS Labs, were there also some metabolites or other substances that were detected as part of the testing, but below your lab's reporting limits?
So we did find substances that were below the threshold to report, and that is why they're not on the report. But they are in part of the data package that was requested, and one can see those there.
And do you keep those litigation packages or that data as part of your standard operating procedures or the course of business at NMS Labs?
So all of the data is part of the course of business. The litigation package is actually pulled from that data on request, but yes.
So as part of your testing, the lab's testing of the samples in this case, I'd like to ask about the testing process for methamphetamine and whether there were findings of amphetamine.
Sure. So when we had a positive, the screen was positive for methamphetamine by a method called LC time of flight mass spectrometry. And anything that's positive above a certain threshold by that procedure is then confirmed by an alternate procedure. In this case, methamphetamine was positive on the screen, and we ran the confirmation test for amphetamines. The amphetamines confirmation test actually consists of 10 compounds, but we're only interested in the target compounds that we are actually confirming in this case. So in this case, we did detect methamphetamine, and because it's a metabolite of methamphetamine, there was evidence of amphetamine, but it was below the reporting limit, so it was not reported.
And you indicated that amphetamine is a metabolite of methamphetamine, is that right?
Correct.
And does that mean then that the body breaks down methamphetamine into amphetamine over time?
Yes, it does.
In addition to confirming the presence of amphetamine, was there also an indication on initial testing of buprenorphine?
There was an indication on the LC time of flight screen, but because it was below the reporting limit, it was not confirmed, so it's merely an indication.
And when you say indication, that just means it didn't go through that second step of the process, is
Correct.
that right? What is buprenorphine?
Buprenorphine is a drug that's prescribed. It's called Suboxone, and it's typically prescribed for opioid agonist therapy for people that are going through opiate treatment.
And are the components of Suboxone both buprenorphine but also naloxone?
Yes.
And is naloxone essentially generic Narcan?
Yes.
Getting back to the blood that was tested in this case, you indicated that it was hospital blood, is that right?
That's correct.
What's significant about using hospital blood for testing?
Well, hospital blood is if it's antemortem blood, is more representative of what is actually circulating in the body prior to the time of death. After death, there are changes that occur with drug concentrations, particularly in central blood, such as blood collected from the heart. And that's a phenomenon is known as postmortem redistribution, where drugs go from areas of higher concentration to a lesser concentration. That is less of an issue with peripheral blood samples, such as femoral blood, but it can still occur. So it's ideally you would want to try to get a sample as close to the time of death as possible.
And if a blood sample is taken after death or after extensive CPR on a patient, can there be some postmortem redistribution?
I think that's possible. There's a lot you don't know, but it certainly is possible. And if it does, it tends to increase concentrations.
When you say increase concentrations, does that mean that the level might show higher than it actually was at the time of death?
Correct.
What about hemolysis? What's hemolysis?
Hemolysis is the breakdown of a red blood cell.
And does that, or did it have any impact on the testing in this case?
No, I mean, that would have an impact on certain clinical chemistry tests like potassium, which is stored in red blood cells. But when you analyze a blood sample for drugs, you're analyzing the whole sample, so it would have no effect.
So you mentioned that NMS Labs receives thousands of samples a day, tens of thousands of samples a year. Did you review and compile some data from the year 2020 with respect to NMS's fentanyl cases and methamphetamine cases?
I did.
And would those help you to contextualize the results in this case?
Sure.
Your Honor, I would offer for demonstrative purposes, Exhibit 920.
Any objection for demonstrative purposes? And what was the number again, Ms. Hilton?
Sorry, Your Honor?
Exhibit number?
920.
Next one is you see the demonstrative purposes only, which means members of the jury won't go back with you for deliberation, but you'll be received for illustrating our witnesses' testimony.
And if we could publish. Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Dr. Eisenschmidt, I'm going to have you describe what's shown on the screen.
So as of right now, we're looking at what happens when fentanyl is metabolized over time to norfentanyl. So gradually, the amount of fentanyl starts to decrease and the norfentanyl starts to increase.
And that's what happens as the body metabolizes fentanyl, is that
That
right?
is correct.
Next slide, please. Describe what's shown here, please.
So this is data from NMS labs from year 2000. And we looked at the fentanyl concentrations in postmortem cases, specifically in those, and only those, that were collected in peripheral blood. Again, for the reasons I mentioned before, central blood, like cardiac blood, can have significant postmortem redistribution. So we wanted to look at samples that have a minimal amount of that.
The year 2000, is this data from 2020?
Sorry, 2020, my mistake. So this is in the year 2020. And we had 19,185 cases that we looked at. And in the peripheral blood, in these postmortem cases, the mean fentanyl concentration, average fentanyl concentration was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter. And the median concentration was 10, median being 50% above and 50% below.
With respect to peripheral blood, you indicated that you chose the samples that would have minimal postmortem redistribution. Is that right?
Correct.
And why is that in comparison to this case?
Because the sample that we had of hospital blood is probably going to have less issues with postmortem redistribution than we would have had it in postmortem blood.
And in these cases that are represented as postmortem cases, are these cases that you would be getting from ME's offices or coroner's offices?
Correct.
And where the individual would be deceased or dead?
Correct.
Okay, so
we also looked at the norfentanyl concentrations, and those were 6.01 as a mean, and the median down at 2.2 nanograms per milliliter.
So just to clarify, with respect to these postmortem cases, the average level of fentanyl was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter, and the average level of norfentanyl was 6.01 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this slide shows some postmortem cases with no norfentanyl, again for the year 2020. So out of those 19,185 cases, we had 15,455 that included fentanyl and norfentanyl, but there were 3,724 cases with no norfentanyl. There were 6 that were exceptions to that for reasons of testing purposes, but those are the ones that were only fentanyl, but no norfentanyl.
So does this slide indicate that there was a significant number, this 3,724 cases, where there was fentanyl found, but no norfentanyl at all?
Correct.
All right, next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is switching gears. We're looking at the DUI, driving under the influence, fentanyl concentrations that we found in 2020. So these are blood samples that are sent to NMS labs for people that were suspected of driving under the influence of drugs or potential other reasons of way they were driving. And in this case, we tested, we had 2,345 cases that were individuals that were alive that had fentanyl on board. Of course, other drugs may also be present, but this was specifically looking at fentanyl. And we had a mean concentration of 9.5 nanograms per milliliter, a median of 5.3. And then for norfentanyl, a mean of 5.42 and a median of 2.2.
And again, just to clarify, for these 2,345 cases, those individuals were alive, is that right?
Correct.
And you indicated the average fentanyl level, I believe, is 9.59 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Yes.
and the average norfentanyl level for those cases was 5.42 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right? Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this is just a breakdown of the fentanyl concentrations we found in drivers that were alive. So almost the majority of them were under 5 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl. And then we had another 26.3% that were between 5.1 and 10 nanograms per milliliter. And then the next set of data was we had 216 cases which were between 11 and 15 nanograms per mil. So that would be in the same area of Mr. Floyd's level of 11 nanograms per milliliter. And then we had several, quite a few cases that were even greater than that. We had 109 that were between 16 and 20, 81 that were between 21 and 26, 133 between 26 and 50, and then we actually had 53 cases in living subjects where the fentanyl was greater than 50 nanograms per milliliter.
So comparing Mr. Floyd's level to the driving population where individuals were alive, his level was within a quarter of the pie of the DUI cases that NMS Labs has received. Is that right?
He would be right in there with about the 80th percentile.
And you indicated that those levels for drivers were found in 53 cases higher than 50 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
So those individuals were alive and essentially driving at that time.
Yes, pretty amazing.
All right, next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this is basically the postmortem concentrations or samples, hospital blood samples that were submitted by Mr. Floyd, and we found fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter and norfentanyl at 5.6 nanograms per milliliter.
Next slide, please.
So this slide shows what the ratio of the parent drug to the metabolite is. So 11 nanograms per ml divided by 5.6, the norfentanyl gave Mr. Floyd a ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl of 1.96.
And essentially, does this slide show just the way in which you would calculate the fentanyl to norfentanyl ratio?
Yes.
Next slide, please. What's shown on this slide?
So this slide shows the ratios of fentanyl levels between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter. So that range was chosen because Mr. Floyd's fentanyl concentration was 11 nanograms per milliliter. And when we do driving under the influence work, we actually assign an uncertainty of measurement to that result. So if a driver had an 11 nanogram per mil fentanyl present, we would report that as 11 nanograms per mil plus or minus 2 nanograms per milliliter. So I did this to see, well, what kind of ratios do we see between postmortem and DUI cases when the fentanyl level is between 9 and 13 nanograms per mil? What kind of ratio do we see? And we can see in the postmortem cases, the mean ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl was 9.05 with a median of 5.88 versus the DUI population where the mean was 3.2, median 2.24.
And then just to clarify, in the bar that shows the postmortem cases, were there 3,088 cases that you looked at between the range of 9 to 13 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter.
And the ratio in the postmortem cases was 9.05 on average, is that right?
Correct.
And then with respect to the DUI cases, you were looking at 275 cases between the range of 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so the average ratio within that group was 3.20. Is that correct?
Yes.
How does Mr. Floyd's ratio compare to that data set?
So Mr. Floyd's ratio is roughly just a little bit below the median ratio in DUI. So in postmortem cases, we know fentanyl concentrations can be much higher than norfentanyl concentrations because frequently these are deaths due to fentanyl. Other drugs may be present, and there could be other reasons for the death. It doesn't say that these are all fentanyl intoxications, but just looking at it as a whole, a large amount of data, this is what we observed. And we know with the DUI population, they are alive. but other drugs may be present as well. So it's really just to sort of look at how things look differently in the living and the post-mortem population.
And does this slide also show that Mr. Floyd's ratio was below the average and even below the median for that found in DUI cases?
Yes.
Next slide, please.
So this slide is actually just a sort of a summary of the previous slide, but it basically shows the relationship between fentanyl and norfentanyl between the postmortem DUI cases and Mr. Floyd's.
And again, does it show how norfentanyl levels essentially increase over time in relation to the fentanyl levels?
As one lives and metabolizes fentanyl, yes.
Next slide, please. Now, did you also look at data with respect to methamphetamine for 2020 at NMS Labs?
We did.
And what's shown on this slide that's up right now?
So this slide shows the concentration of the methamphetamine found in Mr. Floyd's hospital sample. It was 19 nanograms per milliliter. And then, as we talked about earlier, amphetamine was below the reporting limit, so it was not reported.
Not reported, but detected as part of your confirmation process.
You can see it in the confirmation data, yes.
Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this slide shows DUI methamphetamine cases with amphetamine and without amphetamine as a metabolite. So we had 3,271 cases that had methamphetamine in our driving under the influence population. 2,975 of these included amphetamine, and then 296 were just methamphetamine with no amphetamine.
And again, when we're talking about the DUI population, these are individuals, this 3,271 number, individuals who are alive, is that right?
Right.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is a further breakdown of what we see in our DUI methamphetamine cases. So the mean methamphetamine concentration in all of our DUI cases was 378 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine. The median was 240 nanograms per milliliter. And in the 5 to 20 nanogram per mil range, with 5 being our lowest limit of quantitation, we had 192 cases between 5 and 20 nanograms per milliliter, which is in that range that Mr. Floyd's methamphetamine was.
Does this graphic also show Mr. Floyd's level of 19 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, it does. It shows on the bottom. And again, 94% of the DUI cases that we tested had methamphetamine concentrations in excess of 20 nanograms per milliliter.
So in essence, Mr. Floyd's level was within the bottom 5.9%, is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please.
Excellent. So
What's
that's
shown
not
here?
what killed him.
So this is just a further breakdown of what kind of methamphetamine concentrations we have observed in drivers in the last, in 2020. And again, other drugs may be present. But in this case, we had 196 cases between 5 and 20, 306 between 21 and 50, 399 between 50 and 100, 571 between 101 and 200, 1,010 between 201 and 500, 578 between 501 and 1,000, and then an additional 215 cases that methamphetamine was greater than 1,000 nanograms per milliliter.
So again, you had 215 cases where the number was greater than 1,000 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Correct.
And the biggest piece of the pie, the 30.9% of the cases were between 201 and 500 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Yes.
So Mr. Floyd's level of 19 nanograms per milliliter, that was exceptionally low, is that right?
In relationship to the DUI driving population, yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Yeah.
I would imagine this will be the last witness for the day.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
All right. It's a little unusual for you to be testifying in a death case, is not?
Not terribly. I mean, I do work with medical examiner and coroners a lot, but they typically are the ones that testify as the cause and manner of death. Usually, if I'm involved in the death case, it's usually drug delivery resulting in death.
Okay. And so you work in a laboratory that works with medical examiners from around the country, right?
Correct.
And you perform these services in a variety of different contexts. Agreed?
Yes.
So you testify that some are, clinical in nature, some tests are clinical in nature, some are law enforcement in nature, and some are death related, right?
Correct.
All right. And you, at the time you became involved in this case, you were obviously aware of the significance of this case, right?
Yes.
And your laboratory goes through an accreditation process, correct?
We do.
And part of the accreditation process is to establish standards and reporting thresholds, right?
Yes.
And so the reason a laboratory will have those thresholds is to be consistent in how toxicology is reported to various individuals, right?
Correct.
And so one of those accreditation standards is actually to have and set this threshold that if a particular chemical component is below that threshold, you would suggest not reported, right? Or you would say it's not reported.
So there are instances where a medical examiner might ask us if something was present below a threshold. And depending on what the situation is, it could be potentially reported as such. It's not common practice. In this case, we didn't do that.
It's not common practice to report things that are below, or chemical components below the threshold, because it's contrary to the accreditation standards. Agreed?
So it does depend on the situation, but by and large, there's a reason we have cutoffs, and if we go below those, it basically is not something we typically would do.
So an analyst who comes in hypothetically and may see certain markers that have an indication that something is present, but refuses to acknowledge its presence, that would be because of those accreditation standards, right?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Hypothetically speaking, if an analyst from, say, the state crime lab comes in and a question is presented to her about the presence of a particular substance, but that substance was below the reporting thresholds.
I'm going to back to Your Honor. That's
Correct.
my answer. There's no characterizing.
It's a hypothetical. Overall, and that analyst refuses to acknowledge the possibility of the presence, right? That would theoretically or hypothetically be because of those threshold rules.
So I really can't speak to what is done in a crime lab because I don't work in that area. So for me, it's really limited to toxicology and the analysis of biological samples like blood or urine.
So, in other words, the reason we have these thresholds is so that we set the rules, right?
So the reasons these thresholds were actually established, it has to do with the original validation of the method. The thresholds are not set because of any standard that says this is what you have to use as a threshold. The laboratory establishes those and then writes SOPs in accordance with their validation for the procedure.
SOPs being standard operating procedures. Yes. And so if the laboratory sets this standard and says, here's the standard, and then does something in contravention or reports something that is against that standard, that would be a violation of the standard operating practice, right?
If it were reported without any explanation, yes.
So just a few kind of follow-up questions to your testimony. You've met with or spoken with members of the prosecution team several times, right?
Yes.
Including February 26th, March 5th, March 12th, April 5th, and April 6th?
That sounds right. I don't believe that dates.
Understood. You wouldn't disagree with me if I told you those were the dates?
I wouldn't.
Right.
And,
He already
I was
said
provided
this.
with meeting notes and summaries of your conversations, right?
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that I understand and the jury understands the difference between fentanyl and norfentanyl, okay?
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
You would
this
agree that
freaking
fentanyl
guy.
is the active ingredient, or when you report the fentanyl concentration, it's the active ingredient, right? Now, when a person ingests essentially any substance, controlled substance, doesn't have to be an illegal drug, the body metabolizes that, correct?
Yes.
And then the body eliminates that, right?
Yes.
Through the natural processes of the body.
Yes.
Right? And the elimination of the substance results in what's called a metabolite. Agreed?
Yes.
And so fentanyl being the active ingredient, norfentanyl is the metabolite or the breakdown, correct?
Yes.
And included in this particular case, you discovered a fentanyl concentration of 11 nanograms per milliliter, right?
Yes.
And a norfentanyl level of 5.6.
Yes.
Now, you testified on direct examination that could be one of two scenarios occurring there, right?
Yes.
One scenario is that a person took a certain amount of a controlled of fentanyl, and enough time had passed to eliminate that, correct?
Correct.
Or to break it down and have that metabolite being present. That's one scenario, right? The other scenario, as I understand it, is someone took some, that initial dose began to break down, and then the person took more, and so the active ingredient is there, but it had not yet broken down, right?
Correct.
So it's sort of either, and you describe it, I think, as an acute ingestion or a non-acute ingestion.
So, a person, when you have fentanyl will break down to norfentanyl, but you could still take more fentanyl. So you could still take fentanyl while the first fentanyl was breaking down.
Right. So put it into context of people who may consume alcohol, right? I have a beer. My alcohol concentration is going to rise to a certain level, right? Whatever based on the alcohol concentration. Agreed?
Yes.
And my body will essentially immediately begin to decrease and eliminate the alcohol, right?
Correct.
But if I have a second beer, I'm adding more alcohol, causing my blood alcohol concentration to rise, correct?
Yes.
And that's similar with all substances, including fentanyl.
In general, yes. I mean, so alcohol is eliminated at a fixed rate over time. There's only so much you can eliminate with time. With drugs, some drugs it's a little different, but
some drugs may be faster, some may take longer, right? And when you describe the results in this particular case, you're talking about, I'll strike that, sorry. So there's, based on a strict interpretation of these test results, there's no way to determine at what point any particular amount of fentanyl was ingested. Agreed?
I would agree with that.
Now, fentanyl, again, being a toxicologist, is a lawfully manufactured controlled substance in the United States, right?
It can be prescribed as a fentanyl patch. It can be a lollipop. It can be used in surgery. So there's different forms.
Right.
Lawfully prescribed.
And the fentanyl that is contained in a patch or a lollipop or that an anesthesiologist may administer is in a very controlled and known manner, right?
Yes.
Now, when we're talking about the illicit street drugs that involve or include fentanyl, you have really no way of knowing what the particular fentanyl concentration is literally from pill to pill, agreed?
Correct.
And so every single pill you take, it becomes a unique experience for the person, right?
That's true.
And so regardless of whether you have a tolerance or a non-tolerance, any single incident could cause an adverse reaction.
Well, sure. If you suddenly had a pill that was 10 times the amount of fentanyl than another one, then yes.
And you have no idea, right?
You don't know from pill to pill. True.
Right, because they're not manufactured in a controlled environment.
Yes.
Now, in terms of, you understand that there were some pills found on a floor of the squad car,
That's my understanding, yes.
and those pills were tested and contained the DNA of George Floyd, right?
I heard that, yes.
And presumably those pills were not in there prior to Mr. Floyd being in the squad car, right?
I assume not, yes.
And so you understand that as those pills were tested, those pills were at least appeared to be partially ingested or partially dissolved.
Okay.
And so there would be evidence of an
Okay.
acute ingestion of fentanyl and or methamphetamine at the time Mr. Floyd was in the backseat of the squad car.
Let's do one objection. Which one would you like? Sustained. Are you familiar with the term hooping? You can answer if you know.
I don't.
The word what? Nobody's watching with
Now,
me. So
in
I don't-
terms of your slideshow, and I don't have an electronic copy of it, some follow-up questions on some of your slides. You reviewed in 2020 a total of 19,185 fatal overdose cases, right?
No, not necessarily fatal overdoses. They were cases that were from medical examiners. We found fentanyl in a peripheral blood sample, but they could have been homicides. They could have been other drugs involved. So they were just basically random fentanyl concentration.
Gotcha. So someone may have been shot as a part of and killed as a result of a gunshot, but as a result of the autopsy process, they collected the blood and analyzed the blood as a part of the normal autopsy process, right?
Correct.
So the cause or manner of death being, gunshot wound, homicide, but we still look at the blood,
Yes.
right? Okay. And it was a total of 19,185, right?
Correct. Peripheral blood samples.
So when the slide says 19,185 fatal overdose cases, you're not suggesting, it's somewhat misleading, I think, to me, because you're suggesting it's a fatal overdose case.
I didn't think it said that.
Well, we can,
If it did, that was something I corrected on the other day, and I said that's not correct.
okay. So just, this is, and I apologize for the writing where it says fatal overdose cases, that's not correct.
Okay. So you got to watch this guy because he is slick. He'll try to throw in some little piece of misinformation or he'll kind of twist it just a little tiny bit to make it seem like, well, maybe is it possible that somebody could die from a below the threshold amount of fentanyl in their system? Things like that. So he carefully words his questions to put the witnesses into like a gotcha moment. Ha ha! I gotcha. So like, right, that's what he's trying to do right now with using the word overdose.
We're going to do a little work in the break, but we'll give you 5 minutes. Thanks.
All right. Well, so they're going to take a 20-minute break. I don't have any viewers. People are coming in and out in just a matter of seconds. So I thought I would try this and see if anyone was interested in watching, and apparently nobody is. So I probably won't do it again. So anyway, those of you who did hang out for a little while, thank you for doing so. And I'm just going to go ahead and end the broadcast now. I am watching this on the Washington Post YouTube channel. That's where I've been watching this entire time. I guess let me put my contact information up real quick. So these are all the places that you can find me. I do pay for this platform. So if anybody would like to donate some money to help me continue paying for this platform, there's my Cash App. There's my Patreon, and then I also do cash transfers in Facebook Messenger. So, yeah, every little bit helps. All right, so it looks like they're going to take like a 20-minute break or something. So,
Any light to shed on this?
Oh, wait.
What's going on?
Wait.
Yes, sir. I received a Bates stamp 49606. And apparently, and I printed it and I started working on my preparation. Apparently, at some point, I received an updated copy of this same presentation, and it's 49623. So it's like 17 pages later, and I'm just trying to verify when I received that because I was using this as preparation. This was all last night.
Fair enough.
Your Honor, this would have all been provided in the same course of discovery. I'm not sure if it was the same batch that went out, but obviously the witness, during our witness prep, the disclosures that were made updates, the slides were updated, the updated slides were shown to the jury.
So there's nothing. So I understand what Mr. Nelson has was an earlier version. Witness has since updated them. You showed the jury during direct the updated version.
Has both.
Mr.
Nelson.
No, I'm asking you, you showed the updated version to the jury.
That's correct.
All right, when was the updated version sent to Mr. Nelson?
I would expect the same day that the original version was approved. My best guess is to April 6th, but I would have to confirm.
April 6th? So this Tuesday?
Correct, Your Honor, which would have been the same day that the other slides were sent. We just needed updates.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's take our break and let's nail it down specifically, but I think we can hardly, there's a lot of moving parts. I don't think anybody's it. I think you can just acknowledge that this is what you received. Without showing it again, then you received an earlier version that's been updated.
And that's fine, Your Honor. I mean, part of the problem that we're experiencing here is I'm getting these things in many of these items in PDF format, right? Some of them I'm getting electronically from, there's so many people involved here that I'm getting things in different formats. So if I can have a second to speak with Ms. Voss.
Yeah, I guess it just seems like there's a good faith passing in the night of different versions, and nobody should be criticized. Or again, let's just tell the jury this is the latest one and this is what it is.
And that's perfectly fine, Your Honor, and I am happy to provide an extra copy. We are happy to provide and republish the slides that were presented to the jury, but I do want to make sure that we're not showing the jury inaccurate information.
Okay, well,
It's my fault, Your Honor, because we received apparently the second version on April 6th, and I must have looked and just assumed it was the second copy of the same thing.
Let's just clean it up when the jury comes back. Tell them that you were relying on an earlier version. The amended version is the one that the witness showed during direct examination, and leave it at that.
And perhaps it would help if I could get a copy of that.
Okay, we're done until we're done with the break. Let's
Okay.
convene at,
well, so that's that.
what are we at now? About
I thought that was going to be a little bit more exciting than it was. So anyway, have a good rest of you guys' day. Justice for George Floyd. Peace.